I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome to Arcane Mark GM Tools Dynamic Encounters. This is all about how to build cool, interesting encounters that are not just a slugfest between an orc, a pie, and some PCs, um, but instead have multiple elements that keep the PCs engaged, whether that is for your home game or whether that's something that you're doing actually for a published adventure, as Linda has certainly done in the past plenty of times. I have not written as many published adventures, mostly done homebrew adventure stuff and a lot of published rules. So, we're going to talk about that, as always. Ask in the chat if you have any questions or want to talk or question about experiences you had with dynamic or maybe less than dynamic encounters. And otherwise, we'll give some tips.
So you said orc pie and the players. I vote for the pie. I think the pie is gonna win that encounter.
The pie is gonna win between orc pie and the PCs.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that might be more dynamic if the pie was like floating around and going into people's faces.
Well, yeah.
And
Now I'm
causing them
assuming
to
that
be
the pie
blinded.
might be a hazard that's creating some
Could
additional
be.
situations. So,
Linda, I want to ask you a little bit about that. And so I was going to ask you, Linda, because when it came time to do the Pathfinder playtest quests, where they were each about like a different facet of the playtest, and yours was the quest that was about skills and dynamic encounters.
yes.
So you were given a task that said, Linda, I write something. It's going to be in the puddles, and it needs to do that. So I know what you eventually wrote because I run that at Origins. But how did you approach that process as the freelance author who was also a major organized play developer?
Yeah. So when I consider dynamic encounters, there's a few different factors that I think about. There's what is the role going to be of skills in the combat? So are there going to be so this is sort of a broader sense, whether it's a hunt that's causing a skill to be involved, whether it's another type of hazard, or whether it's, maybe you need to roll acrobatics checks because the ground is slippery or something like that. I would say that what makes a dynamic encounter fundamentally is anything that disrupts the flow between the PCs are in sort of like a generic battle map, and they and the enemies run up to each other and hit each other until one side is dead. So whether that is in the case of the encounter that I did there, I was thinking about the skills first and foremost, primarily because I wanted it to be a way to show off the power of the 3-action system in second edition and how it could be used to have skills take a more prominent role in the combat, because there's no longer this expectation that you have your one standard action and that's it, which you can totally still do dynamic encounters in first edition. It just sort of changes the way that those work. So,
I know that there were some issues, like when you guys were doing the Jade Regent Part 3 tower fight. I made it dynamic with like lots of little crystals that you guys could disable that would screw over your enemy. But the problem was that because it was a standard action to disable it, or you could bash them and deal damage to them, you guys rarely actually interacted with that, and I knew how much you could get out of it, but and I knew that if you had, it would have been worth it, but it was hard since you guys were definitely losing that fight until you decided to be possessed by Pazuzu to win the fight. It was hard to say, oh yeah, we'll just stop fighting and just do this crystal. That's probably good, because you totally lose your standard action.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's okay to give spoilers for a playtest adventure since it's in the playtest. So can you tell us a little bit about that particular encounter, the one in Puddles for Rose Street Revenge?
So that encounter, you have a few different factors that are going on. You have an ooze. It starts off with a room, and there's an ooze in it, and the floor in the room has kind of acidic sludge from the ooze. But up in the rafters, there's a bunch of bats, and the bats whenever the combat starts, they are going to roll in sort of as an initiative, as a complex hazard triggers. And
Thanks for following.
yay! Thanks for following. Chiron Valfor looks like. Welcome. So you've got these little pieces of the ceiling that are falling, continually falling into the acid on the ground and splashing PCs. And then you've also got this bat swarm that then has joined the encounter as a combatant. But the bat swarm is also a thing that a combatant that you can, if you know, with nature, you can kind of calm the bats so you can handle the combat in a different way there that's
You
not
can handle
attacking
the
it.
combat in a different way.
Yes, you can handle the combat in a different way, Mark. I did
Okay.
not. That was not intentional, but I will own it. Yeah. So I guess there's sort of three aspects in this encounter. There's sort of the standard. There are multiple aspects. There's a standard monster. There's some kind of hazardous ground that makes certain squares better to fight from than other squares. There's also a doorway that enters into the room where the ooze is. So with that, you could sort of back away around the corner and then come forward to attack. So you sort of have that choice of how exposed are you going to be.
But
If
the
you're not
ceiling's
exposed,
collapsing even if
yeah.
you go out of the door, but you're
Yeah.
not exposed to the ooze.
Yeah. But then you still have the collapsing ceiling, which sends the collapsing ceiling can send acidic sludge out past the door if you're anywhere that can even possibly attack.
Every time I ran it as with pregens, Ezran and Fumbus stayed out of the door and they were fixing the ceiling.
Yeah.
With their crafting skill. Generally, Kyra, because it was the pregens that we had at Origins, Kyra was making friends with the bat, and one time was played by like this adorable little girl who made friends with the bats and wanted to bring them along, and one of them like hid under Kyra's headdress and then used it in a later quest. It's like, are there still some bats here? I was like, yeah, sure. Can I get it to like bite this stupid guy? And so I had it come out and like bite for 1 damage and do 1 bleed.
Yeah. So then the idea is that the ooze is just in the combat room. The hazard is splashing out of the room into any zone where the PCs could attack
And
from.
The bats could be a problem at any
And the bats
time.
could go to any location. So speaking of aspects of being dynamic, there's the map and how it sort of divides the map into different zones, where different zones have different advantages and disadvantages and different things that you can fight and different things that you're protected from. There's the fact that there's different aspects of the encounter that PCs can address. They can try to calm the bats or fight them if they're mean. They can try to fight the ooze, or they can try to deal with the hazard. And the only way to really make that whole area safe so that the PCs can ultimately search the area and find the treasure and information that they want is they need to deal with all three of those aspects.
Cool. So we're just talking a little bit on the chat about the Discord for Arcane Mark, which you on YouTube, we have not mentioned it, but there are links on the Twitch and also in a few other places, and that we have a Bat channel and a Leshy channel, because Linda is a fan of those two types of things.
Yeah, and those few other places will soon be including below YouTube videos, so this one may even have one down in the description.
Then you guys will have an actual link for you. Awesome. So, like, that's a good example of, it's a simple dynamic combat. It wasn't like, it's not that hard to run, even during a quick quest. But it gave something for everybody to do when I was running it. Like, generally, Mauriciel and Valoros would be beating the crap out of the thing, and Cairo would be working with the bats, and Ezran and Fumbus would be repairing the ceiling, and it wasn't just, if everyone had just focused on the ooze, then, well, first of all, they would have gotten bat attacked and hit by the sludge, but also the ooze wouldn't have been very satisfying. It was the fact that so many things were going on, and the ooze was plenty strong. It just couldn't survive a full attack from, like, everybody pouring their energy against it, and it's slow. So probably they would do that. It would go once because it was a pretty badass ooze.
Yeah.
And then they would kill it. But as it was, the ooze usually got like 2 turns to act. and everyone was pretty happy and excited about the
And I
encounter.
think that that gets back to another thing about dynamic encounters is creating choice, where choice of how you approach the encounter really where it really matters. So which aspect of the encounter do you want? So if it's a dynamic encounter, it's often going to have multiple different pieces that the PCs can interact with. Which one do they want to interact with first? What positioning are they going to want to use for the encounter? What kind of tactics are they going to use for that? So then if you completely ignore one aspect of the encounter, then you know it's going to keep coming at you. You know, sort of like the room. So I can kind of think of too, like, if you had an encounter in like that iconic trash compactor from Star Wars, where it's like, well, you could just keep fighting the monster, but then this room might just crush you all. You may need to deal with this as well. So you have multiple things that are kind of going on at the same time and vying for your
I
attention.
totally ran that in the Starfinder playtest, the very short closed playtest, in my Ryza of the Rune Lords game.
Wasn't it Ryza of the Star
Oh yeah,
Lords?
Ryza of the Star Lords. That's correct. In the Thistletop Moon dungeon, which was a forest moon.
Mm-hmm.
They definitely had a random trash compactor room with a monster in it just to see what would happen. It was fun,
Mm-hmm.
but absolutely. So Nitrace has a weird question. According to Nitrace, we'll see if it's weird or not. In something like a Pathfinder Society game, where combat's supposed to be scaled to a party of four and is a fight but not inherently risky, a lot of times you end up with six at a table. Even with scaling options, Nitrace says, most fights seem to be won just pretty easily due to action economy.
So there's a lot going on in this question.
Let's start with Pathfinder Society First Edition, which is
Let's
the
start
one
with
Nitrace must be asking
let's
about.
start with first edition Pathfinder Society post the introduction of the six-player assumption.
Yes, because
So
he mentioned
yeah,
scaling options.
yeah. So after since like what was it like season oh gosh was it like season 4 when we first started having scaling sidebars. The idea is that scenarios are fundamentally written with the assumption of a six-player group, and then the scaling is provided to scale down. We're going to be flipping that around in second edition, but that's not something to get hugely into just yet. But when you're
That's
talking
true,
about
but I will say I talked to John about what he's cooking up, and I'm very excited about it.
yeah, it's pretty
That's
exciting.
all I'll say.
But we
I'm not going to drop spoilers in here
mm-hmm.
of what things actually are, but I'm excited about it because, and you will be excited too if you agree with me about the following statement about Society First Edition, which is that the arithmetic mean of a level of the levels of the party members is insufficient to determine how strong a party is. Four 10th level characters is not the same as a 20th, two 20ths and two first of a party, and this caused, in my opinion, some issues with Pathfinder Society 1 tables where you have a table that's like, oh, we're playing the 8 to 9 sub tier, and we're playing the 6-player adjustment. You add in a 7th player, and it's like, oh, well, now we're not. Now we're playing an easier thing, even though we literally added someone to the table.
Yeah, so to go back to
Oh,
that sort
it
of
looks like Arcane agrees with me on that. So if you agree with that, then I think you'll like what's coming forward. But I can't say anything else about it.
so speaking to the issue of action economy and how many NPCs in a fight there are versus how many PCs in the fight, this really gets into a whole dynamic of a lot of different pieces that come together. So there's how many the more combatants that you have in a fight, generally the longer that fight's going to take, and so the longer you're going to have to budget for that to take in the scenario. Also, a fight that has more combatants is going to be more constrained in terms of like either it's going to be in really tight quarters or you're going to be a lot more limited in terms of what maps you can use to have those, because generally when thinking about the space of encounters, we have to imagine not just your group of 4 players, but your group of 7 players that may have a couple of animal companions, and what's going to happen if all of them try to participate in this combat. Are they going to be able to play? I mean, you're not usually going to have 7 players and 7 companion creatures like I
Wait,
did that
didn't
one
one of
time.
the didn't the tiger companion have a familiar?
Yes, that was why.
It was like Kevin Willis's
Yeah,
tiger with a
yeah.
Familiar.
The tiger one of the animal companions had a familiar, which I passed on to the one player who didn't bring an animal companion to play, so they wouldn't feel left out.
Yes.
And they also had like an onyx token for the what was it? What is it called? Like the ebony fly token.
The
And
ebony
then they
fly
and then they
figurine.
like summoned stuff, and then they had camels, and it was just like, why do you do
This
this to
dungeon
me?
cannot fit this.
It's like some of you are not going to be in all of these rooms, guys. Sorry. Yeah. I think that there's the constraints both of space in terms of how many things you put in, and also the more creatures you have, the weaker each individual creature has to get. And so there's the risk, particularly because we know that there's a wide variety of optimization levels, but generally PCs tend to have better defenses than the monsters expect them to. So if you go to the lower level monsters, I'm all speaking about first edition here. If you go to the
First
lower
edition.
level monsters, you will run into a lot of situations where they just can't hit, and that's just not really going to be as satisfying for the players. So we tend to err on the side of not having quite as many things as there are PCs, both because the things would be weak, because the fight would take longer, potentially since there's more moving parts, it's more complicated for the GM, it's more miniatures, and it may ultimately be less satisfying in terms of the challenge that each individual piece could bring to bear. So that's probably a wordier answer than you were looking for, but that's my full answer to that question.
That makes sense. And so that was the answer to the question that was about the idea of scaling in organized play. During that time, we had a lot of interesting additional questions about encounters. For example, Nitrace was talking about the idea of a gotcha encounter, like the famous Pathfinder Society early scenario that had, sorry, burp, a little bit of a gotcha fight in there
Mm-hmm.
that was sneaky. And versus a lot of times it's like, hey, it's that angry guy. Beat up that angry guy. And then King Trash asked, how much does the minion trait have an effect on 2e action economy for somebody who is just loaded up with minions? And I would say it definitely means that it's not going to overload your game like the 1e minions, which is what King Trash actually speculates a little bit later down in the comments.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, it's super good to have one. Much as some people online who are used to just getting multiple extra turns that are more powerful than their group's badly built fighter. Whoops. It's definitely not that strong. But
Mm-hmm.
spending one action to get two actions on something that's a little bit weaker but doesn't use your multiple attack penalty is pretty good. Because it gains an action and it doesn't use your multiple attack penalty. Plus, you can even use the work together. We definitely had an archer in our War for the Crown who he had his wombo combo, which was his whole turn was one shot. He wanted to make sure it would hit, and what it did if he hit was no save, slow, dazzle, or bleeding and dazzled for as long as bleeding from the blood going into their eyes. Um, the
They were
slow.
slowed.
They were also on a critical hit, stuck in place, and they had to pull the arrow out, which was very easy. But when you're slowed one, and your second action is to pull the arrow out, you
You
don't
better
have
hope your
you better
opponent
hope
is right
your
next to
opponent
you.
was next to you and not pull the arrow, because if you have to move, that's your turn. And his third action was to get the bird, and his two actions were this fighter feat that slows things. So um, definitely they are something in encounters that are not going to completely throw off the whack of encounters, and it can allow you, if you've been worried about, like Linda said specifically, it's like a lot of groups don't have those companions, but they had to design everything in case they did.
Mm-hmm.
Now you don't have to worry because they're cool, they're fun, they're a lot of fun to have, but they're not going to totally throw everything off.
So they'll still be a factor in terms of physical space on the map. They're just not as much of a factor in terms of what you have to consider might be there when you're scaling encounters.
So King Trash is asking, what about a necromancer with lots of zombies? So if you wanted some combat capable zombies, you could have a few like really strong singleton zombies and yeah, that would take a lot of your actions to command them. But the general idea that Jason's talked about, and certainly I think Linda took it to heart, is that if there's enough zombies, that might be its own creature that is just like, yeah, you know what I've got? I got a big old swarm slash troop slash,
Mm-hmm.
I've just got a big group of zombies, and the monster is zombie horde.
Yep.
And you know what that zombie horde can do? Well, whatever it wants to do. It's a zombie horde. It can envelop you and like beat on everybody that gets near it, throw some of the zombies out of the horde at you, or whatever the zombie horde that you want to create
Mm-hmm.
does. And we might want to create it too because it's cool and use that as a type of creature.
I
And
can
then
imagine a plague zombie horde too.
a plague
That
zombie
like throws
horde,
its plague
and then
zombies
they
at you and
explode
they
in a
explode.
disease.
Yeah.
Yes. So then you would animate that creature, zombie horde, and then you would have a zombie horde.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty awesome because having an actual on the table 50 different crappy CR1 have zombies in PF1 is absolutely a thing you could do in PF1. And they
How
would,
many d20s do you have? How long
yeah,
is that going to take you to roll them out and see how many natural 20s you get?
and they die like in the first fireball. They were a waste of everyone's time by a massive amount, but that way the zombie horde could be like whatever level monster. I picked 10 because it's the double digit. A 10th
Mm-hmm.
level monster, and it would cost the same as other 10th level undead that you raised, so it wouldn't cost a fortune because you just raised 100 undead, and the minimum black onyx in Pathfinder First Edition was not that high, but times 100 it is.
Yeah.
And then you could just because I think a lot of the reason that most people want a zombie horde is because it's freaking cool
Yeah.
to have a zombie horde and be like, behold my horde of zombies. And so I think you could fulfill that fantasy better with a monster that is a zombie horde than you actually can. Having had someone try to do that and be very dispirited when the first fireball killed the entire horde, is like, well, that's thousands of gold pieces down the drain.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is going to make it easier. Army of skeletons. Army of bloody skeletons. Actually, after the zombie horde didn't work, I think that player made only bloody skeletons after that.
Yep.
Because enemies rarely bring the few things that destroy bloody skeletons, and they were okay with them being weaker if they didn't just keep getting killed. Alright. So, that's, I think, wasn't that much of a squirrel, honestly, because when it comes to dynamic encounters, what resources the PCs bring in that could gum up the works of a dynamic encounter are super
Plus,
relevant.
having fun monsters like this that are that take on somewhat of an unconventional role. I mean, another nice thing about having sort of like this horde or troop is that it condenses a lot of creatures into a small space, so it's not completely monopolizing the battle map.
All right, so Arcane is asking, what about a minion that is super bonded and maybe even more valuable than the master? Well, we don't have rules for that yet, so I can speculate. My speculation could be that if you're so bonded to a creature that like you're sharing in Pathfinder First Edition, Eidolon shared item slots. If you're sharing that, you could do something that was like, well, between the two of you, you have 4 actions, no more than 3 on the same person, because no more than 3 on the same person. You could do something like that, right? And then you could do 3 and 1, 2 and 2, the 1 and 3,
Yeah.
etc. That could be interesting, although if we did something like that, we need to work out how to deal with stuns and slows. I would imagine that you would have to take away the stun from that shared action. So, like, if you got stunned for 3 actions on the summoner, you can't just say, well, I chose to give the summoner only 1 this turn.
But let's say that both the summoner and the hypothetical summoner and the hypothetical Eidolon are both
slowed 2,
Yeah.
then I would say you probably don't get any in that case, maybe. But that might not be satisfying, so that's why this off the cuff answer is something we would have to look into.
Yep.
I mean, slow 2 is real bad, and slow 2 on 2 different creatures should have a pretty negative effect. But
Yeah.
In any case, even if we let you cheese it out, the most you could do is get 1 action on one of them anyway.
Yeah.
So I think the more problematic one is when just one of them loses a ton of actions, and then you assign only 1 action to that one, and we can figure it out if we even do something like that. So let's move back a little bit more towards what we're thinking of with dynamic encounters.
Yeah.
So in general, and by getting Linda to use her thought process there for that adventure, I think that really helped a lot. I've often noticed that Linda likes to put in encounters that are more than just what they seem. Just like you guys were sometimes talking about surprise encounters, like when we fought this horrible water elemental and all these bad things were happening, and then we realized that like tiny, almost microscopic holes were in the wall that was letting a lich attack us through the walls, and we
Hmm.
had to dimension door through the walls to get to that lich, and only some of the party members could do that, and the others had to fight the ridiculous fiendish water elemental.
I think what really made that work well is the idea that you have the big, flashy, obvious thing that everyone's gonna rush for, and then you have the more subtle, secret thing that makes its presence known. And even if the thing that makes its presence known, it can be interesting if that acts on the first encounter, but it can also be interesting if the first round. But if it can also be interesting if it waits a little bit to act. Just keep in mind that that in combat encounters don't last that long. So if something is delayed to past like the end of the second round, you really can't count on the fact that it's not really more two sequential encounters. So I generally like to have the second round be the time that things come in.
That makes
If
sense.
you're gonna do stagger stuff.
There's another one you did once where there was a room with like a an in character puzzle that mostly required us to go to different spots in the room, touch
Mm-hmm.
things, and possibly use disabled device.
Yes.
And every round, at the end of the round, a more powerful daemon was being summoned, some of which were way too powerful for us to actually beat. And at that point, that was a really cool encounter because at first we were like, oh yeah, it just summoned a daemon and it was very easy.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time there was like a Thana I think that the only reason we didn't lose like 2 to 3 party members was the fact that we discovered that, and you guys can use this for as long as you keep playing PF1. Some daemons have like ridiculously high level spell like abilities, but their
Mm-hmm.
concentration check bonus is crap. So it's like, oh, I'm a level 6 daemon. Give me here's this 7th or 8th level ridiculous spell I can cast on you, which has a concentration DC to cast on the defensive of very high. Oh look, I can't cast it on the defensive reliably because I am really low level and I have this very high level spell. So, in fact, our wizard realized he couldn't counterspell spell like abilities, but he also realized that shooting them with a crossbow for 4 damage
Was likely
was
to
enough
hurt the
that they
spell.
probably couldn't cast their spells. And if that
Yep.
wasn't true, then we would have been like, I guess a Daemon definitely is someone who could bone you.
Yes.
Um,
But it
so
was. But
uh,
yeah. So
that's
the
another
yeah.
another example though of an interesting dynamic encounter is one where fighting can't win.
Yeah.
Um, or it would be very unlikely for it to win, and instead there's some other task you have to do, but you probably need to fight at least enough that it doesn't get overwhelming in the fight.
Yeah, and if you're doing a fighting can't win encounter, it's important that you make sure that that's clear to the PCs before the point when their characters are all dying from it, because fighting can't win. If players can get very used to the idea that the challenges that they face are always appropriate, and so if this is further level and something they can defeat, and so if this is breaking from the mold, making sure they have a way to know that so that they can act in that way. And then in that case, the PCs were prioritizing mainly deactivating the various things they needed to do to get out of the room and move on to the deeper levels of the dungeon. Compared to, I believe in that case, if you left the room, then the demons wouldn't chase you. But you
Once
didn't know that.
we didn't know that.
Yeah, you didn't know that, so I figured that like if you guys like decided to beat a retreat, then they
It's
instead of
okay
trying
as
to
long
make
as my
conflict it.
familiar was fighting with her staves. My bard wasn't useful for that much else. He could just do the puzzle. And you know,
Mm-hmm.
if someone had died, it would have almost definitely been the druid's animal companion tiger that he sent when he wasn't there. So
Yes.
that he that's the only character that 100% was dead except for the clutch wizard counter spell with crossbow strategy. And we would have just had to tell him why his favorite tiger died when he didn't show up. Um, let's see. Arcane says a season 9 PFS scenario featuring a troublesome ghost had an interesting dynamic encounter. Could brute force your way through, but it was very difficult. Skill checks to make it a doable fight. I feel like that you had a ghost related adventure with like dancing or something like that you
Yeah,
did at
there
some
was
point, but that wasn't season 9.
that wasn't season 9. That was oh gosh. Wasn't
I
that one
know
of the
which adventure it
that
was.
was
I just don't
Blue's?
know what season it
Yeah,
was.
that was
That was
Blue
Blue
Spire's
Spire's part.
part three.
The labyrinth
The
one.
labyrinth one, yeah, Labyrinth of Hungry Ghosts,
Yes,
season seven
I
something,
think so.
7 dash something. Yeah, but yeah, the general idea where it's more challenge, where there's easier and harder ways to approach things, and certainly one of the nice things that comes about that is that the way that the PCs discover the new ways to approach things, this could be skill checks that happen during the course of the encounter, but it can often be fun if the way that they know, if they learn that by virtue of gathering clues earlier in the adventure, and then they can use that knowledge to make something that would have been harder much easier. Especially because then the players are like, "Oh yeah, this is the thing that that clue was referring to," and now we can apply that and we can make our lives easier, and then it can be a really great feeling as a player to realize that you've put two and two together.
Right. And definitely, one thing we tried to do with complex hazards in Pathfinder Second Edition was show you guys how you can make a complex hazard that perhaps on its own is a dynamic encounter. You don't necessarily need a ton of different things if you have a very intricate complex hazard. So that can be kind of cool. I definitely saw at least a few in pretty dynamic encounters showing up, especially in Liz's Pathfinder Second Edition scenario. I won't tell you
Oh
anything
yeah.
about what the encounters are or what's in them. Just that there were some dynamic ones in there that I thought would be pretty interesting
Mm-hmm.
for the very first
And
scenario.
people are definitely going to get to see that because that is the that's also going to be the repeatable adventure as well that's coming out of Gen Con.
So Silly Jeffy has a statement that I want to turn into a question because I think it's a really good question what I do. So I'm going to paraphrase. Silly Jeffy says, most of my players are binary in thought patterns, either murder, hobo, or talk. They don't often think out of the box. So I'm going to now turn it into a question. How can I get my players to think out of the box and in a dynamic encounter to interact with the encounter in a way where they're interacting with all the parts of it, Linda? How
Yeah.
can they get players who are more likely to just be like all this to branch out?
So I think that what I was talking about before in terms of having clues beforehand. I mean, in this case, if this is not something that they're used to, even if it's not so much a clue that you figure out, but more of a like someone tells you like, well, you know, if you do not deactivate the great flames that surround the room, the grand skeleton lich will be nearly impossible to kill. And then if they go to the room and then you make a big deal about like how the flames are surging and every time they hit the skeleton lich a flame surges and heals the skeleton lich and things like that, then it's sort of like, yes, here we go. This is a case where you're putting you're very much making it clear that doing that sort of non-traditional action is going to have a reward. And Arcane has a great point is whenever they do use that out of box thinking to reward it and make it clear how helpful it has been.
Yep.
It's sort of like how when you have the bard player who's giving the party buffs and things like that, keeping track of when it was the bard who caused people to hit, and then it's like, that's really close. Oh, you hit because of the bard, and then like
Yep.
you can ask the bard like, so how are you inspiring them today, and things like that. So making it clear when certain player actions tipped the balance over
And I'm going to
caused a
give the
better
opposite
circumstance.
of being clear with carrots, which is phantom sticks. So,
Mm-hmm.
arguably, maybe it would have been equally effective if Fumbus and Ezrin were attacking that ooze in Linda's encounter, and because she didn't make it that devastating if the trap goes off on you. It's bad, it's bad like ooze is bad, but they probably would have been no better or worse off if they handled them one by one than if they did them all at the same time. That all at the same time was just more fun. So I just made sure that I didn't tell them what damage it was going to do. I'm just like, yeah, the roof is kind of collapsing and it's going to collapse into the acid and splash. So I kind of scared them because that sounds even worse than what actually happened. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
actually, that is literally what happens.
Yeah.
But then it only does like some small amount of damage because it's a first level adventure. But they
Yes.
were like, crap, this is something we need to make sure definitely doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And but they also were like, well, we can't just leave the ooze, and some of us are not good at crafting. So that sort of meant, I think that is part of why all of my groups split it apart. Because I absolutely agree with Silly Jeffy that a lot of groups get tunnel vision and are going to do things one at a time. Not only that, but Pathfinder is a game that rewards focus fire. It
Mm-hmm.
does. Because it's not like when you get the monster below half, it's weaker. You better kill that thing or it's going to keep doing its stuff. So I would say, yeah, basically, they're always going to tunnel vision on killing the monster. You don't need to do something to get them to do that, but if you want them to do something else, um, scaring them about what that other thing could do if they don't handle it, also giving them a actually one when I said being vague on that, but you can be one way you can be not vague is give them a countdown clock where it was
Mm-hmm.
like, ooh, after one round the crystals seem to be like a third of the way charged up.
Yeah.
They look like they're dancing with lightning.
Mm-hmm.
They might do some kind of lightning shock that like chains lightning throughout the entire room or something.
This
And
is.
maybe it's only a shocking grasp level of damage and it's not that bad, but when you say that, they're going to want to look at that crystal.
This reminds me of, and now this was and now this was actually a combat encounter as opposed to other things, but it worked just as well for a hazard. There was in the demo for Starfinder Beginner Box of PaizoCon, there was a robot that charges up with lots of electricity, and so I had it constantly being like, recharging electrical attack, new attack incoming in 12 seconds, and things like that. So I mean, if the circumstances require, you can be pretty blatant about how quickly things are going to be falling, or maybe give them a skill check to recognize certain things that their character would know. Because
Right.
then if it's tied to, if it's something that we talked about this in a previous episode as well, but if it's something that's super obvious that their characters would definitely see, just letting them know so that you have a shared understanding of the world. But if it's something that a character might need to have like some understanding of, like the architecture of the building, or of the nature of magical rooms that kind of look like this, and how long might it take before they explode, then giving them that sort of prompt for knowledge to say, hey, okay, yeah, now you actually know that this is a particular fact, and because your character is knowledgeable, oh, guys, I know that this is a problem, and the GM took the, and then there's sort of the implied, the GM took the time to make this a role, so it's probably
Right.
important.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, that it feels like it was a reward, so it's like, oh,
Yeah.
we can do the advanced thing by handling
Yes,
this.
exactly. And then, that doesn't require them to handle it, but if they ignore it and something bad happens, then they're not going to be looking at you like, why did you do this to us? It's like, oh, wizard, you totally told us we probably should have done something about those runes, and then we didn't, I guess. Yeah.
Yep. And in Fighter Squad versus the Throne of Chaos, most of the encounters weren't that dynamic since we had 4 hours to do 12 encounters, but the mid the mid fight and the final fight both were. And in that one, I just sort of let the things happen and didn't give any prompting and just let Fighter Squad eventually realize that they needed to do something else other because these stupid snakes just kept appearing and attacking them over and over again. And they did. One of them that people are like, "What are you doing? Fight the snakes!" And he just started doing some weird stuff. Like, oh wow, we're gonna do that. So it worked out pretty well. Dynamic encounters done well are generally a lot of fun for everyone. Even if they're done not that well, or you just have a problem like I did for the one in Jade Region, mostly they'll still at least have fun with the part that they interacted with, and then the rest of the dynamic encounter just sort of is a generic thing, making it harder. It didn't make it more dynamic that time, but it rarely actually makes it worse. The only way it could is like Linda said before when we got on the slight tangent about the companions, is if it throws too much into the fight because of how many things are on the field, and you know your group.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of knowing your group, tip for dynamic encounters if it's not a published adventure, which is you know your group, you know what they like, you know what they want to deal with, you know what their fantasy is, making the character that they built, and you can put something in the dynamic encounter that is just absolutely up their alley. That could also be an answer to helping Silly Jeffy a little bit with those players, where like if you know that there is a diviner in your group who loves runes and deciphering runes, and you have something that's like, well, and he loves ancient civilizations. Like it looks like an ancient civilizations left a giant arcane cannon down here, but these someone would have to decipher these runes in order to shoot it at the dragon. Then
Mm-hmm.
um, he might decipher those runes. to shoot it at the dragon instead of blasting the dragon straight off.
Yeah.
So if you have something in a home game that is just right up the alley of what one of your players wants to do, um, they're more likely to engage, and then that lets you use Archaon's tip of make the cannon just so, like, if you use exactly this cannon example, make sure that it was much better than, especially if it takes multiple rounds or whatever to figure out the runes, much better than what their spell would have done to the dragon.
Hmm.
So they're like, whoa, and then that can get them a little bit more in it and thinking about the dynamic aspects in later encounters, even if it has to be as blatant as a giant cannon the first time.
Literally a giant cannon.
Like literally a
And
giant
especially
cannon.
if it's something, and this gets to a similar point is making sure that that alternative venue is rewarding. So like if it takes 3 rounds to charge the giant cannon, you want to make sure that no matter what, the giant cannon is still going to do a lot of damage. That they can't just like roll badly once and it's like, well, you just wasted your 3 rounds of effort. So I imagine now this giant cannon is letting off some great shockwave of arcane energy, and they may be rolling to
A reflex
a
save.
reflex save the dragon, and they may be rolling a reflex save, and maybe it takes half damage, but it's still going to do something cool no matter what. So another aspect of dynamic encounters is the concept of multiple objectives.
Yes.
So if their goal isn't just to defeat the enemy, but the goal is also to rescue the hostage or to save the library that is also burning down because it has important information, or to grab the documents, or to fight through this area so you can grab the documents before someone else grabs them and runs away, or things like that. If there's some kind of other person or treasure or information or something like that that exists in the encounters as a secondary objective to preserve, so that just beating the enemy with huge amounts of damage as efficiently as possible is not going to get them as resounding of a success as if they split their efforts and try different things as well.
That's absolutely true. Especially if someone, like you said, is their life is at risk. Most PCs, and it depends on your group. Some of them are more mercenary than that, and a book or even gold would help them more.
Mm-hmm.
Treasure helps a lot of PCs, but if there's people dying and you have a situation, where the villain maybe sets it up, it's like, what will you do, hero? You could fight me, or you could save these people. A lot of groups are like, they want to do both, and that's
Mm-hmm.
a way that you could get them to split up and deal with the dynamic aspect of the encounter. Uh, some groups might be like, we'll focus this guy first and then save the hostages, so you can deal with that in a way. Linda already gave a lot of good ideas just immediately in her pitch. Fire, for example, or a row of hostages. Say that there's hostages. There's fire is coming towards these bound hostages, and it's going to obviously reach one of them each turn down the line. So as long as you save one hostage each turn, nobody burns to death. But even if you spend one full round ignoring the hostages and the fire, and just fighting the guy, it would be obvious to the PCs at least one hostage is dead. They can't get a perfect victory
Mm-hmm.
by doing that. Because
Now,
otherwise they might say, or like eventually some hostages will burn down. They'll be like, well, kill him first, save him after.
yeah, and I think that another thing to keep in mind is when you have hostages or other sorts of things like that, that's also very much a know your group type things, because some players can get really upset if their characters fail to save people, especially if like they don't feel that like they had ample opportunity to save those people.
Yes.
So it's something to be careful with, which is part of why I mentioned like information, treasure, vital clues, maybe preventing another enemy or from escaping the encounter, who's like, oh, you're fighting these people, but this person's also running away with it, and they're gonna escape. So you're trying to split it out, and so this is another thing that gets into know your group.
And Arcane says even if they focus fire the villain first, it changes the encounter from a standard stab them to a challenge to do it as quickly as possible.
Yes.
Mirror image cast by the villain with a sneer. It's
Yes.
like, oh, how about this, heroes? Is more impactful.
Please waste your time defeating my illusions, fools.
It has more drama than it would have normally. Where, like, I've used mirror images that took the entire party a whole round to get through them, and at that point, the villain wasted a round, the party wasted a round. Basically, nothing happened. But in the fire, or with the hostages who are dying, that was actually a really dramatic round,
Mhm.
even though that's what happened in that round.
Or maybe if you're talking about speed, The other aspect that's causing the pressure that's making this encounter dynamic doesn't even necessarily have to be in that same room yet, or even yet. It could be, for example, that if the PCs take a while here, then other encounters are going to have a chance to combine, or they know that other things are going to be shifting and changing in the dungeon.
Oh
So,
man, taking it the next level to building
yes.
dynamic dungeons.
How's that for a transition?
Oh, well, I feel like that's a whole other episode.
Yeah, it probably is.
I want to say one more thing about why fire is really good. I mean, goblins agree, so it probably is really good. But one of the main reasons fire is a good example, and that Linda used twice in her initial pitch, is because fire, kind of like a villain, is a non-linear threat at least in most of Pathfinder fire rules, which I admit are super inconsistent between each adventure, because just like real world fires, the more squares of fires there are, the more that the fires have been lit, the faster the fire spreads, because there's more fire and that spreads to more fire. So, just like dealing with a villain early so they can't take more actions, if you don't deal with the fire first, and it's a fire, it's going to be way harder to stop it when you go to the fire. Now, they might decide, let's ignore the villain and only deal with the fire first and then turn to the villain. But arguably, the least interesting thing is fight the villain and then deal with the fire, and it's actually, depending on your fire rules, very bad to do that because the fire could just be out of hand. Because fighting the fire while the villain's attacking you and trying to stop you is very interesting. Just generally, since the villain is a reactive and dynamic creature, having it around for a little longer because of the dynamic elements is what you would hope
or
for.
even if the villain isn't directly in that room, but you hear the villain from the next room chanting and casting huge numbers of pre-buffs, and you know that, like, or you hear the forces amassing on the other side of the door, so you have this sort of push and pull where PCs feel like their decisions matter and they're making the choice at which difficulty do they want to, which thing do they prioritize, and which thing do they want to nip in the bud.
Elf Tarot is talking about Gloamworks incident for sure, but not by name. Which is yeah, definitely there are a few Pathfinder Society authors who really like doing dynamic encounters, and Golemworks Incident is one with a very dynamic encounter, as you would expect from Larry Wilhelm scenarios in general. They usually have something that is like so cool, so hard to draw on your map.
Well, that's because Larry Wilhelm is so good at maps. It's like,
I know.
I can tell a Larry Wilhelm map in an instant, even if I don't see that it's him. It's
like,
oh
whoa,
yeah, that
look
was
at all
him.
the things that
None
are happening
like
in
that.
this encounter. This is a Larry Wilhelm adventure. So that was super cool encounter. Definitely when I played it and when I ran it, and it had a little bit of the sleight of hand, because I think one of the things Elf Tarot was talking about that's very scary turns out that, like, it's afterwards not quite as bad as you might have thought, but it sure did freak us the heck out when we were playing that game.
Yeah, another thing that you can play with that's an escalating threat that isn't fire is escalating probabilities. So like you are rolling in front of the players like a chance that something terrible happens, and you let them know the chance is getting higher every single time.
And Arcane points out that a dynamic encounter can give you an amazing, like, this is Sparta or you shall not pass moment. And his example was his fire, not his fire, there was a fire. His rogue found a choke point door that was the only way in and held off against everything.
Nice.
Tanking that entire encounter so everyone else could put out the fire and then they could turn their attention. That's one of the coolest aspects of dynamic encounters is that you get your players to not just do what Silly Jeffy says that they sometimes do of tunnel vision. It's just like, we'll all attack, but you get them actually just to be more creative than maybe they would have been in a straight out encounter, because they have to come up with not just the strongest spell that they always use. They have to go out of their comfort zone, think a little more outside the box, and come up with a tactic. And hold the choke point with our defensive character while the rest of the people put it out, then turn and put all our attention onto it. That's a cool tactic. And I bet it worked well, because if you have almost everyone dealing with the fire first, you can just stop it.
And That also leads naturally into one of the ways to start thinking about what might be nice for a dynamic encounter, and when the is if your players tend to be using the same tactics and the same themes over and over and over again, try thinking of a situation in which those wouldn't necessarily be as effective. And what would cause that to not be as effective? So if they're always rushing up into melee, maybe there's more obstacles in the way that they have to try to go through. If they're always firing from range, maybe they don't necessarily have as many opportunities to do that based on the way that things are constructed. So trying to think of ways to break the PCs out of the mold of things that they are used to doing that are more more interesting than just like, oh, you always cast fire spells, so everything from now on has resist energy fire and protection from energy fire. Good luck with that. I mean, yeah, because that it's not fun if like everything negates your standard tactic, but just shaking PCs out of their comfort zone can really lead to a lot of interesting and engaging fights.
I think that is definitely true. Let's see. So Elfter was talking about a possible tactic of using rock paper scissors or another mini game to handle something like mirror image, where the enemy is theoretically moving the images to try to screw you up. And I could also see mirror image with play the hat game, where you actually literally put a ball under the cup and
Oh
then swirl them
yeah.
all around. Which cup is this ball under? And use that instead of a die roll
Oh, that one didn't have the. Yeah,
for the
and
mirror
maybe like
image.
each of them has a different pawn underneath them, or like a different little standee, or a different miniature, and you're just like, so you hear them rattling, and then you lift it up. Oh, wrong one. That wasn't the one you were meaning to attack.
And sometimes it doesn't take much to make it a dynamic encounter from one that wasn't. And I'll give an example of this from something I did in my Shattered Star playtest game. I took something that was like a pretty simple hazard and made it a dynamic encounter for fun. So, Linda, do you remember when you guys went into, in part three, you went into the dimension?
Yeah, and there was that weird pillar,
Yep.
and there was that weird pillar that we were trying to
What
deal
was the
with.
main thing you remember about that pillar?
Well, the main thing that I remember about that pillar, because I was playing a very smashy smash character, was that the things that those characters with those knowledge skills had when we're doing with those pillars was very very important, because the things that I was trying to do, my character was frustrated that they did. I thought it was cool, but I was playing like a super Gorham smashy smash character. It's like, yes, that pillar thing is important. Do the pillar thing.
So you would say that the occult monk using occultism and with his shard of
Yes.
pride refusing to give up even when he once critically failed
Oh
was
yeah, and then
very
oh
memorable,
yeah,
right?
oh yeah. But was that like whenever he? Oh yeah, and then with like the terrain shifted, and then it was like,
Yes.
yeah,
So
and then he was like kind of getting pulled off into nightmares, and we were like, why are you still doing this? And he's
and
like,
then
I'm
he
definitely
and
gonna
then
do
he
this.
sealed it.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's right. And then and
No,
then we
so
finally stopped
all
getting
of that
attacked.
I added to make it more a dynamic encounter. It was just like a very simple random thing that happens. But I was like, it'd be more fun since the monk has occultism
Mm-hmm.
and likes to talk about having occultism, but isn't necessarily super great at it, but has the shard of pride, so he'll definitely have to try.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, we have a bard who's got occultism. What if there were occultism rune things that you had to do on the pillar and that interacted with the encounter? And that was just where I started because I was already converting things to
Yeah,
the playtest at that point. And
that was what, like a year ago,
most,
I think.
um, at least,
Yeah.
because it was in house. That's why it was like Mike Sayer was the monk, the bard
Mm-hmm.
was Ron Lundeen. It was all Paizo staff members. But basically, the main thing I did was just add in like these weird rune pillar things that you could deal with, which you had just teleported through the rune pillar.
Yeah.
It's just that it became irrelevant because it caused creatures to come out and attack you, and that was it normally. And you
Mm-hmm.
can just add in a little bit of stuff to do to make it dynamic, and it doesn't take much, even if the published adventure doesn't have that element. Just find something you can latch on to that seems like it would be cool.
I also remember from Shattered Star
Also,
the constant.
notice that Linda doesn't even remember what monster was summoned
Yeah,
that she
I
was
know. I
fighting.
remember that the pillar was cool and that the pillar was super useful.
She only remembers the dynamic aspect of it, and I didn't talk to her about this encounter beforehand or stage this or anything. It's just I found that to be true. That's why I wanted to ask to see if it was true. Is that people will remember the dynamic aspects of your encounter.
What about that time that you were inadvertently taking a bath in a pool that was actually constantly dispel magicking you? It cast level 20 every round, and that was the only reason that you were okay in that fight against the
We would
Sugathis.
have TPK'd against that friggin' advanced fiendish Sugathi for certain if the sorceress hadn't decided, the kooky sorceress hadn't decided to like strip and go into this bath for no reason while other people were investigating the next room. And
She
she's
was
the
just
one who
taking a
sees the
bath.
past, present, and future too. She's it's like in the future time I will appreciate having relaxed.
And the other PCs are like,
And the other
okay,
PCs are like,
whatever, bye.
but that pool does caster level 20 dispel magic. You're gonna lose all your buffs. That's
Whatever.
fine.
And then the Sugathi comes out, and she's just like,
And confuses
everyone.
everyone.
Because they all failed.
They all failed their saves against it because you got like a surprise round and then another one, and it has an aura.
Sugathis are nasty. Be careful with monsters that are nasty
There were
compared to
three
their
will
CR.
saves, and everyone failed one of those three. And then Source Shen's Happy Fun Pool caster level 20 dispel magic, the one that was on the sorceress. And she was able to then dispel one that was on, I think, the Bard. And the Bard from the previous Sugathi fight had taken Unbreakable Heart.
So then
and
they
cast
used
Unbreakable Heart on the Barbarian,
yeah.
who went into a rage and was then superstitious so he could make his saves, and it was a chain reaction. It all started because there was a random pull.
Random dispel magic pull.
It is absolutely not part of the Sugathi encounter. It's in a different room. And
so sometimes players can make encounters dynamic when you least expect it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So another thing that's important for dynamic encounters, and when you guys get your last AP volume for the last AP, you'll see that I maybe talk about dynamic encounters in there a little bit with respect to the article that I put in there about final encounters. Is that if you want a big boss fight, a dynamic, or if you, I've buried, or I've put the lead out too early, although obviously in this episode that will be the lead. If you want a big, yes, if you want a big, memorable, major fight, you should probably consider making it a dynamic fight. Because, first of all, especially if it's a big boss, and it's in PF1, which is what the article is somewhat about, but the article doesn't only say dynamic encounters, it has a lot of tips. But dynamic encounters are important because the same way that Linda's level 1 ooze was being protected to last a little bit longer and do some things, if you have a big villain and it's not just that your final boss encounter is like 6 really hard guys, if you have a big villain, you need to protect that villain from PF1 characters or else it won't get a turn. So that just is what it is in PF1. If you use some of these tips and also do a lot of homebrewing, high level play can be super fun. Some people say, oh, it's not fun in PF1 because the math's busted. The math is kind of busted, but it can still be super fun if you know what the math of your group is. You play to their strengths. You make something that is perfect. I've said before in this stream, I had an epic level 3.5 group that I ran, and they almost died to a CR21, and they easily beat a CR40. And I knew those would happen because I had play tested by myself with the character sheets that I knew of the players, and I was, oh wow, they're going to have a lot of trouble with this 21. I'll make it a boss, even though it's the same level as them. I'm going to make this 41 a boss also, but I want them to feel badass, so I'll tell them it was CR40 afterwards. The CR system at high levels is not what actually determines what's going to be a problem for your group.
It's the rock, paper, scissors aspect of what's good against what.
Yep. Rock, paper, scissors again. But in terms of that, having a dynamic encounter is absolutely a great way to have a good boss encounter. So, a lot of people have linked over the years to my full setup with Karzug from the end of Rise of the Runelords that I forced Linda and her poor unsuspecting
but that was
allies
so cool.
to deal with, which instead of having him in a straight charge lane for where the PCs appear and laughing at them and then would have been killed immediately by the barbarian's pounce, I had a whole bunch of different precautions that he took, and each time they defeated him at a certain point, it wasn't even just an arbitrary final form like I did in Jade Regent for fun. No, it was legitimately a spell, and you killed the body.
That was his like undead anatomy clone or whatever.
No, that was in the wall. He was possessing. He was possessing the body of.
Oh, you're right. The undead anatomy clone was in the wall.
Yes, because it was incorporeal.
Yes.
So every time they beat one of his other things and he had to set up, he would use time stop, put up some other buffs that might have been
Mhm.
on his other thing that they just killed, get where he wanted, and then start kicking the crap out of him again. Plus, there is actually a pseudo dynamic thing in the Karzuki counter that if you're losing, you can still screw him over. That the party decided to do just in case.
Mhm.
So, final encounters, um, having precautions. I also gave him like some constructs that could like siphon off some of the damage and negative effects to him. Although the PCs killed those like almost immediately. But
Mhm.
um,
But still, that was something else
no,
to divert our attacks.
I am glad to see
Mhm.
the fact that that general idea I feel like may have influenced your thinking in some way towards that one with the demons, the Pathfinder Society one with the demons, the very high level one.
Oh yeah.
And
Are you talking about? Are
the
you talking
final
about the
encounter.
yeah, yeah.
I won't say anything else because I'm happy to spoil very early Pathfinder
Yeah,
Society
yeah.
adventures, but this is pretty recent. It's a super high level, very awesome demon one like Rasping Rift.
Yeah,
I'll
rasping.
say the name of
Yeah,
the adventure.
rasping rebirth.
Rasping Rebirth, yes.
Yeah.
But nothing else about that encounter really is too cold to spoil. Just that
Mhm.
I felt like it may have been slightly influenced from you dealing with that
Yeah.
other
Well,
encounter
I mean
somewhere.
that's something that kind of stuck with me. The idea of the idea of fascinating ways that a minion can protect a boss.
Yep, and if they're doing something annoying enough, and are clearly easier to kill than the boss, people will kill them. And I mean that's true in tabletop games, and it's also true I think a lot even in other games that some people are even more tactical and optimized in, like you know like in roguelike games where if you make one mistake you have to start over,
Mhm.
where like the general idea is if there's something that's super dangerous and you can get rid of it with even a remote amount, get rid of it. But otherwise, if there are little things you can kill quickly that are causing a serious problem, first kill
Yeah.
those.
Sort of the how. What is the most efficient way in which you can decrease the danger of the encounter at hand?
And anytime the answer to that question is not killing the boss right away,
Mhm.
that's better for your encounter usually, because usually even if the things the boss do don't actually threaten the party as much as the other things because you created the encounter so the minions actually threaten them a lot with doing some weird stuff, the things that the boss can do are usually very cinematic and kind of
Yes.
badass. So it's like, wow, I mean, you can make minions that do something that's very cinematic and badass, but the feel of the boss doing a big cinematic badass thing is such that if you can get the most elegant and efficient way to win the encounter to not be immediately killing the boss, that can be great. I mean, you can have situations where like the boss has some like chanting ritual going on that makes him invincible, and you have to kill the chanting minions or the to end the invincibility ritual. All sorts of possibilities that you
Mhm.
can do to make a final encounter super dynamic. And of
Mhm.
course, the this is my final form, which I had to do for Jade Regent since it was the Minkai slash Japan adventure pack.
We had a fair number. Yeah. Well, you can talk about that if we end up doing
I
the
will.
third episode of.
But since I wanted to talk about dynamic encounters, so I'll
Yes.
just say this is my final form can definitely make it very dynamic.
Yes.
And when you have a very big and sometimes big in size, like
Fine. You are now worthy of seeing my Bankai.
yes. So if you have a really big and important enemy, you can also wind up creating a dynamic encounter. Let's say you're like, I don't want a trap or weird crystals that are in the room. You could create a dynamic encounter with like let's say it's just one creature. Like it could be a kaiju, and like you crawl all over it, and different parts of the kaiju are attacking you. Like its spikes are shooting off and turning into bug creatures, and
Mhm.
from its back, and you can go on there and damage it there. And like it detaches its arms to try to attack you, and they're a separate thing. Like you can definitely make a creature.
And you're walking, and you're trying to walk on top of it, but then it does this giant. Then it tries to buck all of you off, and you may go flying far away from the encounter, or it creates like this giant wind that can cause serious. That can cause everybody serious issues, or like.
Absolutely. You need to make sure if it's not just like it's like yeah this creature has multiple parts you can attack, that the PCs get a sense that that is true rather than just like why is it doing all this stuff.
Yes.
but you can definitely make a dynamic encounter that in theory is just one creature. Or you could have like some kind of it doesn't have to be a giant creature. It could be like a psychic lich that actually partitioned its mind into different um, like several different phylactery mindscapes, and because of that, the psychic lich will sometimes like flash different colors that correspond to the main color scheme in each of the mindscapes.
Mm-hmm.
And when it does, it's taking actions with that partition of its mind, and so you have to maybe deal with that. Um, you might have to go onto the mindscapes and fight the different partitioned parts of the psychic lich to stop them. Have some people do that to stop the main psychic lich from getting 7 turns.
Yeah.
And getting, or maybe there's also 7 passive abilities that the psychic lich gets from the different.
I was gonna say 7 turns
mindscapes.
seems pretty intense.
Well, it depends on how strong the lich
it also
is and
depends on how many PCs you have. Yeah.
Maybe if the lich is each turn is not that much, and you have 6 PCs, and it have 7 passives, like, well, the green one is giving the lich massive regeneration.
Yeah.
And
or it could seem like in second edition, it's like for each of these things, the boss gains X number of 1 action per thing, so they could have 7 actions if you're letting all of these go. If you're letting all of these go through.
Absolutely. So I do want to ask one question to the chat, which is we've been having a lot of interesting ideas, but it happens nobody's said anything for a little while, and I've started to get worried that maybe we were disconnected. So can somebody just type anything into the chat? All right, great. We were just too mesmerizing, so everyone was just listening. All right, thank you, everybody. Everybody's listening. No problem.
Sweet.
No problem. I was just like, I hope people are hearing that because I thought that was good content.
Yeah.
All right, great. So, basically, your imagination is the key to making a dynamic encounter, and I know that could seem like it's an oversimplification to say, but just something that inspires you or that you think would inspire your players with their characters based on how they built their characters. That's the hook that you can get to cause them to bite.
And I'd say in terms of inspiration, like looking at video games and books and movies and TV shows and things like that for how they set up their climactic confrontations can be a great source of inspiration as well. Comic books definitely as well.
And I'm gonna say that making dynamic encounters, it's not even though I say it comes from your imagination, like it's not super easy, and like I'm not saying everyone should be able to just do it on their own because you have to step back and think about it. If you do, it's also not super hard to do. And it's also something that we talked about for home games a little bit, but it'll make you stand out as a freelancer. Like, as a player of Pathfinder Society Adventures, before I worked at Paizo, there are not that many of the Pathfinder Society authors whose names I knew. There just weren't. But Larry Wilhelm was one of them because all of his adventures were had really dynamic encounters, and they are cool. And he's super creative, but it's not something that you guys couldn't build with some of the tips from this episode. You thought about it, but a lot of people don't. That don't take that time to think about it. And you absolutely have to take an extra step if that's what you want in your encounter. I remember when Linda was working on her encounter, and she did have to step back, and she had me send her. I remember because I had to send her the hazard rules because of the fact that those weren't done yet. So I was like, "Here's what we got.
Please send me the current state of hazard rules because I want a hazard for this again." Yeah.
It looks like Night Trace was absorbing all for his pitch, and they're on the second pass for the pitch. And to answer Arcane's question of what is the pitch, Linda gave you guys some information on the Pathfinder Society Quest episode that is specifically for the Arcane Mark community. That you can send her if you're a member of this community. Mention Arcade Mark, and you can send her a pitch to her Paizo email if you have an idea for a quest. And eventually, because
now I am very, very busy right now.
Eventually, sometimes it takes years to get to it, but eventually she will get to that pitch. And certainly for second edition, that's a good time to get in. because there aren't people who have demonstrated their second edition know-how yet.
Mm-hmm. And we're definitely going to be looking for. We're definitely going to be looking to try some new folks out, recruit new authors, and with Quest, that gives us a great opportunity to do it.
That is very, very cool. And it looks like Night Traces is going to be something with a back to basics, explore, report, cooperate. That's definitely a theme of this first Pathfinder Society season.
That is for sure, because I mean part of it comes from the whole feeling that we had in the organized play meeting, where we're sitting there and we're like, okay, we went back in time. This was our discussion before.
We went to outer space.
We went back in time, and then we went to outer space. What now? And then so of course we're
Whispering tyrants.
Well, no, wait. You don't forget the giant robot.
Giant robot attacking Absalom with a giant robot.
Then there was Planar Apocalypse. And then there's Whispering Tyrant. So that's one thing that we run into with the interactive specials, and if that one wins, I can certainly talk more about that idea of interactive specials in scale. But
right.
Yeah.
But I want to say specifically, all three aspects of explore, report, and cooperate work well with dynamic encounters. Like, none of those three aspects is just kill the thing, or just talk to the thing. Like, those encounters that are dynamic are usually ones that will have the players need to explore a little bit more while handling the encounter. Maybe not report, although if they've been taking notes, it might be able to help them in the dynamic encounter. But cooperating and doing multiple aspects at the same time are crucial for. So I could easily see that, and in fact, I mean, the one I talked about from Liz that I thought had some good dynamic encounters also has, like, I mean, it's one of the early ones, so it has that kind of theme of the society in it. So that.
Silly Jeffy says, I wonder if the dreaded escort quest can be turned into a dynamic encounter. I have one thing to say to you: Night March of Calcamedes.
Oh yeah.
Check out that scenario.
Yeah, the Night March of Calcamedes is a scenario whose rating at the time that I had looked at it, when I was not a staff member, was so high that I was able to use that during a GM 201, where they sort of give you this ridiculously impossible situation and see how you would handle it.
I think it's like season 4.
Yeah, it's in season 4. And so what they did was they were supposed to have a group of people who could not play, that demanded to sit at that table together, but they all had played different things, so they couldn't all play the games. So I kept asking them, and what they were improvising as well for this, and they're like, when was the last time you played? And this person's like, I only played at the beginning, but I've played all of these things, and I only have a level 1 character. So we narrowed it down, and based on what they had all told me, I was like, okay, so it sounds like if you guys, the last time you played was 2 weeks ago, you couldn't have played Night March of Calcamedes, which just came out. And it has, it's like 15 5-star reviews. It's level 1 to 5, so that guy can play it. And it fits this other criteria that this guy can play, so I think you guys can play that.
And the person
and the person running was like, "Did you just make that up? Did you remember that?" I was like, "Yeah, no, I remembered that."
And he's like, "All right, you win." I can't possibly come up with a counter for that. No, I've definitely had fun with
Wow, it's still at 4.5 stars with 43 reviews. It is absolutely an escort quest, but it's hilarious.
Yeah.
Also, it introduces a major NPC that may have been in a scenario with that NPC may have been mentioned earlier so far in this video. So, Silly Jeffy, I think that's a great insight that shows that you're starting to think about dynamic encounters, that you realize that you can turn an escort quest into something that's fun. The real reason I think that they get dreaded a lot in computer games is because the AIs for that person you're escorting are really bad.
Excuse me, please allow me to bumble into the monster that you're not currently fighting. I have no self-preservation instinct.
Right.
I would like to walk over the cliff, please. Oh, wait, you got too far away from me. You died. Now you have to go back and load.
Admittedly, I'm not saying Calcamedes does not have I would like to walk over the cliff.
Yes, but it's funny.
There's a good reason, which they'll tell you at the beginning, so I will say this because it's obvious at the beginning of the adventure. He is sleepwalking due to something weird that's happening to him that the society wants to find out why by following him where he's sleepwalking.
Mm-hmm.
So he is literally asleep.
Yes.
But that makes sense that he does that.
And also, it's funny because like he's got his pajamas, and then he's got like his little cap, and it's so precious, and you have to keep him from walking off a cliff and dying.
Night Trace, for Liberty's Edge, Slaver's End.
Mm-hmm.
Look for Slaver's End. Also,
Yes.
if you haven't already, obviously the one in Galt,
The two.
the two in Galt,
Yes.
for Liberty's Edge with the final blade,
Mhm.
very very important.
Yes.
But that season, yeah, okay, you did that one, but see, you do Slaver's End.
Mhm.
But one reason that escort missions can work better in a tabletop RPG is if you play that character is sympathetic and smart about their own survival, people will not feel like, oh wow, this is so dumb, like they do when they're escorting an AI NPC that's doing pointless stuff. If it's a character that's actually trying to stay out of the way, not be in fireball formation, maybe if you're in trouble, they come in and do something heroic to help you, but that are generally being smart about not getting killed in the escort mission, then I think people will accept it, and that's not what made people dread the escort missions.
Yeah.
Let's see. They
He's talking
rescued
with.
and killed gross bankers. Oh boy.
I see.
Sound
I see that you did indeed play that scenario, Nitrix.
sounds legit. So
Mhm.
let's see. Those are a good starting point on dynamic encounters. I feel like that some of the finer points of dynamic encounters could keep going on into more, and of course, as you
Yeah.
slightly tiptoed us into, dynamic dungeons are a real interesting one
Mhm.
to handle. There's definitely a dynamic dungeon I'm gonna have to deal with soon in my War for the Crown game that is going to be very interesting. Um, Having a dynamic dungeon definitely makes it feel more like the PCs are actually in a place and less like that just you open a room, you kill the things.
What?
We rest for a day, nothing's happening. But
Wait, you mean that whenever I open this room, there's not exactly three human guards who are all standing in exactly these squares as listed on the map, and that's what they do all day, every day, forever, no matter what else happens.
oh, Night Trace pointed out something that I really meant at the beginning. I had it in my head. I was like, we have to say this right away, and then I missed it, which is dynamic encounters because of the environment. We talked about hazard. We didn't. You talked about Summit for setting it up, but
Yeah.
dynamic encounters because the lava is flowing down the mountain. Dynamic
Yes.
encounters because mystical floating platforms are swiveling around, and you can only get them to line up to go towards the other statue that you need to get to every certain number of rounds. When on their turn, they all move. Those are absolutely a great way to do dynamic
Dynamic encounters
encounters.
because the room has a bunch of different levels of elevation that have their own features and their own values and different creatures that are on different levels and things like that.
Yes. So I'll tell you that, and maybe the elevations changed.
Yes.
One of the reasons I missed it is because dynamic environments sort of are something we covered slightly, which is, and they're an environmental hazard. The fun thing about the hazard system is it lets you put the room on the initiative
Mhm.
because you say, oh, well, the room doing this thing is an environmental hazard
Well,
or a magical hazard.
like the Star Wars crushing room trap, for
Yeah,
example.
that's a mechanical hazard.
Yeah.
But yeah, or like a thwomp falling down like Mario could be a mechanical hazard. And it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, on this initiative count, I hope you're not in that square, which the monsters all have like a slipstream wind ability to push you into that square where the thwomp's gonna fall on you.
The room is slowly filling with water. There's a river in the center of the room you can use to quickly transport from one end of the room to the other, but going back the other way is rather challenging. Or like there or you're on either side of a deep pool of water, and so you can sort of shimmy along the narrow walkways. But if you fall off into the water is cold and full of piranhas. But there's
Yep,
also flying monsters that are attacking you while you're trying to shimmy across this narrow hallway.
yep, and they're flying monkeys, and one of them starts stealing your stuff and dropping it into the piranhas.
Yes.
There's a lot you can do. Grab a statue and a boulder falls after you, and the door starts to seal shut.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I've seen that. Um, so Arcane makes another really good point that we didn't mention here, which is we kept saying dynamic encounters. They're so memorable. They're good to use. But just like anything, like just how like for Pathfinder Second Edition, we've talked a lot about. Um, I've seen there's a thread today on the forums about this. About fail forward, and we say it's good to include fail forward, especially when you kind of want this thing to happen. People on the forums are like, that means everything is fail forward. If I miss the monster, I hit, but something bad happens. If there's a vault door that is a 50 DC 50 vault door that is on the king's vault, and my first level character goes there, I open it, but something else happens. No, obviously, fail forward for Pathfinder Second Edition is not.
You always succeed at
You
everything
always
you do.
succeed at everything with a twist.
Yeah.
It is to use it sometimes when it's appropriate. And similarly, Archions makes a very good point, which is dynamic encounters are cool. They make people think outside the box, and some groups maybe actually wants most of their encounters to be dynamic. That's probably groups that don't have that many encounters overall.
Mm-hmm.
But and Edward is right. The Dungeon World or anything powered by Apocalypse World is a yes. But Burning Wheel also and Mouse Guard, which is powered off of that, are absolutely a fail forward situation. Except in combat, for those, then you can be in big trouble.
I generally consider dynamic encounters to be like, some delicious spice. Like, oh, it's great to put pepper in your. It's great to add pepper to your dish, but you don't want to eat a dish that's entirely made out of pepper.
Yes, and so some groups might like if they mostly just talk and solve puzzles, and there's only like an encounter or two per session. Maybe they should mostly be dynamic. That group sounds like they would really dig dynamic encounters a lot anyway. But if you're gonna have like a let's say a dungeon and it's got 20 encounters in there, you probably don't
They're
want
all
all.
dynamic.
If
It's
they're
gonna
all
take
dynamic,
forever.
even I mean sometimes dynamic encounters don't take super long. Like the one we did where Cobra deactivated the pillar actually probably didn't take that much longer
Yeah.
than that fight would have done otherwise because all the monsters went away when he
But
deactivated the
they
pillar.
also do give more to think about, and you need to be sure to give opportunities for players just to rush in and beat the monster with beat the obvious, uncomplicated, definitely evil monster with their weapons until it's dead,
Yep.
and then move on to the next one. I mean, I guess the part of the idea behind dynamic encounters is variety, but simple encounters are also part of that variety.
Yeah.
In the same way that it's good to have a variety of different challenges for encounters, where you have those interesting and challenging encounters that are really cool. But like if every encounter is like that, then your players are going to get bored because
Or
because
they might get overstressed
or they
out.
may get overstressed out because every time they have to think all these complicated things, and every encounter is this huge challenge. So so it's sort of like mixing dynamic encounters, more complicated encounters with simpler encounters, more challenging encounters with easier encounters and things like that can create a nice flow.
And
Just like with writing, honestly, if every sentence is short with the same format, then it gets monotonous. But if every sentence is long and complicated, then it kind of gives you a headache when you're trying to read it after a while.
And Silly Jeffy points out you could have red herrings in straightforward encounters seem dynamic, but they aren't. Or you could actually have an encounter that, like the one with the snakes in Fighter Squad, that seems simple and that it winds up being dynamic. You absolutely can have those too. Just mixing things up is best for most groups.
Mm-hmm.
And dynamic encounters are definitely, if you don't think about anything and just throw an ogre in the room, you've just made a non-dynamic encounter. So it's not hard.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take an extra step to get them, and you're unlikely to be someone who accidentally used too many dynamic encounters. But you certainly could if you take it to too much of an extreme. And there's certain abilities that work better in a more straightforward encounter. Dynamic encounters actually can be a good way to make all of the group matter if there's someone who's really kind of overpowered in a straightforward encounter, but
Mm-hmm.
you don't want that person to not get to do their thing either. Like if you have a wizard that just can, in Pathfinder First Edition, that just will win the fight on the first round on a straightforward encounter, and you made dynamic encounters every time. There's like you have to lift this very heavy thing with strength or something, and it's immune to telekinesis. And then this other thing over here that has to be hit by very powerful divine magic
Mm-hmm.
in order to drop the barrier that stops all arcane magic or something like that.
Yeah.
If you do that in every encounter, the wizard is not going to be happy.
Yeah. So that's sort of like when I was talking about using, potentially thinking about shaking PCs out of their expectations as a way to create dynamic encounters. That's another thing that it's a spice. It's not like you want to block their abilities all the time.
It is one of the tools in your toolkit, and it is a very good tool.
It's called this series is called GM Tools because these are tools. These are not GM how to be a good GM. This time you must.
This is not do this every time. Yes, yeah. We're trying to add more tools to your toolkit as a GM every time we do a GM Tools episode. so that you'll feel empowered to be able to do certain things. But we're not going to tell you how to run your game, and even you might have a beer and pretzels group where it's like, you know what, I almost never want to do this. Maybe just the final boss.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have the tool, you have the power to say, I don't want to use this tool.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you don't have it, then you don't have the ability to use the tool. That's my philosophy in general on learning and adding tools to toolkits, and that's what we like to do here on GM Tools.
Yeah.
All right.
So, was
So
there
have we
anything
missed
else?
anything else obvious? I think that absolutely Nitrace was right that the room that is part of the room or the universe or something else that does something every time
Mm-hmm.
at a certain initiative count something happens is a
If you're
big part of that
attacking the
every
PCs
encounter.
with the entire universe, then maybe you should step back and think about why you're taking your day out on the PCs.
Sure, but I say the universe as in like it's not necessarily a room that you're
I
on.
know, I know. You
Like
may be like in a
when
plane or
when
something like that.
we got mad at the as mentioned before on the stream, when we as a group got mad at the fact that a bad meteor shower was making all of them like every animal in our kingdom just try to murder people,
Mm-hmm.
and we couldn't protect everyone in the kingdom from every animal murdering them. So we teleported into outer space with life bubbles up and just tried to break the meteors, and there were demons out there. Like
Yeah.
that was not a room. When the
No.
meteors all moved with the meteor shower on their turn when you had that happen,
Yeah.
and
And then
slammed into
everyone,
people and dealt
yes.
damage, and on it was on whatever initiative count that people got hit by meteors. That wasn't a room.
No, that
That
wasn't a
was
room.
the universe.
That was the universe. Then again, you did literally decide, let me teleport into space and smash the giant space rocks.
Yeah, we needed to stop the meteor shower because that was causing all the animals to destroy
That was
everything.
still. I maintain that that was not a solution that I considered as possible to that particular
I
predicament.
feel like we didn't do a good job at stopping that cult that believed that the kingdom leaders were gods who would solve every problem. When we did that,
No, I don't
we
think you
kept
did.
telling them to stop worshiping us.
That was one of the events I eventually had in Kingmaker because they were the chaotic good police state that was constantly spying on people just to help them if like something terrible happened, and then the PCs would just keep divinerly sweeping in anytime that something happened, and then yeah, that's so I was just like, you know what, screw it, new event.
All right, so Silly Jeffy has a question, or actually a comment. One of the problems was, as a GM in a Westmarch game, Silly Jeffy gives the hook ahead of time and doesn't know which characters are actually going to sign up. I'm guessing Westmarch is an organized play or living world. It's a Discord group with about 80 active members. So yeah, you're not going to be able to necessarily custom build a
Mm-hmm.
dynamic encounter for your PCs. You're more like a published adventure author then, where you have to try to
Mm-hmm.
come up with one that would work
Yeah,
for any
and
group.
in that case, it's generally good to use them a little more lightly. So if you're doing if you're doing it as sort of a if you know session by session, like you have the people for a few sessions, the same people, you may have a chance to learn them then. And if you don't, having a little bit of dynamic encounters, and then you're also going to get into the general concern that comes in with organized play scenarios of having lots of possible ways to address something. So you're definitely going to want to make sure that like if there whereas Market had the pillar that was, oh, occultism is how you do this pillar because we knew we had occultism in the group, then you might need to have, this is the pillar that you can use with arcana or religion or occultism, so that there's more options to deal with each particular aspect of the encounter, and it's also so that the encounter is resilient and can handle different ways that the PCs might approach it, and being a little more flexible with creative
Let me
solutions.
pivot to Arcanon's point because that
Yeah.
is a perfect pivot. A little bit of smoke and mirrors can go a long way for you as the GM, and I know some GMs like to fudge die rolls. I personally don't, but I have no problem with GMs who do. But I like to be a little bit looser with tactics and other things that can happen. And a smoke and mirror tool that can help you, which is one that Archive points out, can literally do what Linda was saying. Instead of a pillar that you don't have to write down a pillar that can work with any of the
Yes.
four types of magic. You could just say, "There's a magic in your notes. There's going to be a magic pillar in this encounter," and lo and behold, your group is um, four wizards and a fighter. It was an arcane pillar
Yeah.
after they sign up.
Mm-hmm.
That is in that encounter. And Arcane points out that if you give a lot of things in the final encounter that seem like they might be important, where it's like, all right, so the big bad has just finished the ritual. A giant dragon is coming up, and the big bad has mounted the dragon. Although it seems that his rituals control the dragon.
Mm-hmm.
and the princess is falling into the lava
Mm-hmm.
over there, and that's not great because of the fact that she is a powerful mage who wants to control the lava, but she's overestimated whether or not she can control this lava because it is a lava elemental, elder lava elemental that is
And
also there.
so
While
she and the elder lava elemental are in a lava control battle. Meanwhile, the last parts of the ritual are going haywire, and there's
yep,
a giant spiral in the ceiling
and
that's
some
possibly threatening.
yes, it could be even if you win that spiral will open up a rift into another plane. That could be a serious issue. Also, because of that rift, all of the villains' treasure chests have sort of animated, and you need to use disable device on them to stop them from either like eating people or possibly running into the lava and losing the money. And a demon god has taken interest in here, and someone needs to pray to stop the demon god from influencing the outcome. So you could have an encounter that all of those things are things that are sort of in there, or maybe not quite so
yeah,
prodigal.
that's
but,
too many things,
but
guys.
you but our kind points out that the PCs, the ones that the PCs think are interesting, could suddenly become the ones that are a real thing.
And it could
Like
also
if,
be
if
like
people are
instead
like,
of saying
if
like, oh yes, and you know it's the demon god or whatever, it's like you hear these ominous voices
right,
and things
you
like that.
feel
You see these
it's like
strange things.
you say to the cleric, you feel a dark influence coming
yeah.
from Abaddon. And if they're like, screw that, I need to save the princess because of the fact that she's my sister's fiance, then suddenly that Abaddon daemon, I guess it would be then, not a demon, maybe doesn't come anyway, and because nobody is interested in doing that. That was what Arcane was pointing out.
Yeah.
You could have something that was overly dynamic, and then suddenly the one they care about, where it's like, no, the prince, and everyone's like, no, the princess, the dragon riding guy, and hey, that rift in the ceiling is really scary, but maybe they don't put enough resources into it. So then suddenly, all the other side things you could just not worry about. The treasure chests don't cause too much of a problem. The daemon doesn't do anything. They help the princess. They beat the guy on the dragon.
Control of the magma elemental. The magma elemental helps to fight against.
They
the
fight the dragon. They beat the dragon riding boss. But they weren't. But they said they were interested in the rift, and they weren't paying attention to it. So then that opens, and they find themselves in another plane with the princess, the magma elemental, and the party.
Yeah, and the magma elemental's on their side now, so then they get to decide whether or not they trust the magma elemental, whether they want to heal the magma elemental, or whether they think that the magma elemental is going to betray them.
Yep. So you can absolutely do that where you semi-scale back by making the ones that they are more interested in more important. That is also part of the whole, oh my gosh, the roof's going to collapse, and they stopped it, so they don't know how bad that was actually going to be.
Yeah. Rex Liquid, this is. I'm glad you like this completely preposterous encounter because this is not the number of moving parts that anyone wants. But we can keep going.
I feel like I've done like maybe for very final encounters that were maybe that complicated, just not as haphazardly.
Yeah, they were more thematically connected because you know we could go all day and we could go all day in terms of like But then what you really discover is that the treasure chest you accidentally smashed open was a container for the Ancient Lich's phylactery, and the Ancient Lich is going to respawn and blah blah blah.
And Night Trace points out the setting, the lore, and the story can all influence the encounters.
Yes.
In fact, pulling upon the setting can make the dynamic encounter make more sense, fit, and actually make the PCs more likely to engage in it. If you've done set dressing, then your set dressing is the haunted house with all of the haunts. Then, like, the weird spirits that you have to interact with during the dynamic encounter, they're in that moment at that point.
Yeah.
If you've done setting where the volcano might erupt, and then Chekhov's volcano becomes part of the later encounter.
It's like, oh yeah, now the volcano erupted.
Yeah, it erupted. Of course it did.
There we go.
All right. So now Rex wants a diorama complete with the princess and the lava elemental.
And now I'm imagining a comic book, and like the end of the comic book, like the princess, the lava elementals make peace with the princess, and he's like, all right, you know, the lava elemental's like, all right, you know what, you're cool. I appreciate your mastery over magma, and then it shows like the two of them walking off into the sunset, and now they're friends or whatever.
Weirdly, in one of the games I played like a long time ago, there was a ranger who it was like 3-0, and they had a thing they could wild empathy elementals, and they made friends with a magma elemental and called it Maggie.
Ah. I love it when PCs make friends with things you don't expect them to make friends with. It's
Maggie
like,
the Mega Elemental was just with that ranger for the rest of the time that ranger was playing.
mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we've given a lot of good tips. Do you guys have any additional tips for dynamic encounters or questions about using or other dynamic encounters that you've seen before? I'll give you guys a little bit of time to think about that. Um,
Well, let's
so
go ahead
let's
and.
go ahead and say goodbye to YouTube and then give a few more mentions of things to our Twitch followers who have joined in later on. So, bye YouTube. See you
Bye!
next episode for an unknown interview.